boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us a researcher for the Capital Research Center located in Washington, D.C. He maintains the Capital Research Center Library and Research Archive, which provides the bulk of the material for research. He has a BA in International Studies from Hanover College and a JD from the University of Richmond School of Law. I want to introduce to you today Robert Stilson. Robert, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I have you here today mainly because of an article you wrote on a book called Five Fingers Over You by an Armin Wegner, I guess is the pronounced correctly, right? But before we get into that particular article and the content which you were writing about, can you first off give us a little bit of detail about the mission of the Capital Research Center?
Sure. Well, we most of our research and reporting is on the influencers in American politics, especially nonprofits and foundations and individuals, philanthropists. So we look a lot at how money influences politics and also policy debate. And we also branch out into other things like obviously history in this sense, but anything having to do with money and influence in American politics.
With the Five Fingers Over You, though, because like you said, this is kind of a side attachment relation to what you do. But what led you to find Five Fingers Over You, and what compelled you to actually write about it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it was mid last year, there was a recognition in the United States of an official recognition of the Armenian Genocide. And I had seen that resolution come through, and I was reading about it, and led me to read about Armin Wegner, who was one of the critical eyewitnesses to that genocide. And so I was reading about him, and I saw that in addition to all his work with exposing the genocide and later standing up to the Nazis, he had written a book about his travels in the Soviet Union and sort of what it said was foretold the failure of communism. And I thought that was fascinating. And so I looked for that book, and very coincidentally, the English translation of it had been published for the first time earlier that year, just a few months before I started looking for it. So I ordered a copy of Five Fingers Over You, and there was no information I could find on it anywhere. And so I read it, and I wrote that article sort of to introduce it, I guess, back to the world, because it was originally published in 1930 and never in English. So I don't think anybody here had ever heard of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was, I'm assuming it was published in German and probably a few other languages, but never in English. That's very interesting. From what you were looking up about Armin Wegner, what kind of man do you think he was, or what do you know about him?
I know he's well known, obviously, as a writer, a poet, but I think mostly he is known to history as a human rights activist, and especially with the Armenian Genocide. He was stationed in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War when he was in the German military and was stationed there. They were allies in the First World War, and he took it upon himself to investigate rumors of what was going on, and there were. It was a mass murder, expulsion of ethnic Armenians from what is now Armenia, what was then the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire. He investigated it, smuggled out photographs he had taken, smuggled out documentation, smuggled out letters that sort of showed what had happened, and that formed sort of one of the most important firsthand accounts of the genocide that we even have today. And later on, he did the exact same thing. Nazi Germany, when in 1933, when some of the first anti-Semitic laws were passed by the Nazis, he wrote an open letter to Adolf Hitler and denounced what they were doing, and they sent him to a concentration camp and eventually, expelled him from Germany. So I think the kind of man he was the man that would stand up for what was right, no matter what the cost to him was personally. And I think he showed that multiple times in his life.
Yeah, I believe in your article you mentioned that while he was over there in the Ottoman Empire, wherever it was geographically, I'm assuming near Armenia, you mentioned that the Ottoman Empire caught on to what he was doing and requested that Germany basically arrest him and do something about him, which ended up happening. And even still, he is able to smuggle out those things. They were trying to keep it, I guess, low key from getting further out or something. And if I'm not mistaken, to this day, the nation of Turkey still refuses to accept that there was even a genocide from all of this. Is that about right?
That's my understanding too. I'm no historian, but I understand the historical consensus to be overwhelming in everywhere except the Turkish government, quite frankly.
Yes. You also mentioned that, I'll just say Wegner from here on. Wegner, you say he's a World War I veteran, and I'm sure he witnessed the horrors of that conflict on many levels, to include the Armenian massacre. He also felt, I don't know if it's an animosity. He had a very good dislike of the old authoritarian regimes of Europe, as you named them, and that he was even sympathetic towards many of the Bolshevik revolutionary aims. How far in tune was he with them, do you think?
I don't know how closely aligned with sort of the official communist platform he was, but he was certainly, especially by the end of the war, I think he was a convinced pacifist. I absolutely, after especially what he had seen, he was very much a pacifist, very much a human rights advocate, and wanted to see something good come out of that war and something that bettered the lives of people in Russia or anywhere. I think that's what drew him to the Bolshevik Revolution. Was there was at least that was an attempt on its face to improve the lives of people, and I think that's what he hoped it was when he started his journey, and what he gradually, I think, saw over the course of his journey to be not necessarily the case.
I can imagine in that time frame being stuck in their situation when you're used to the old autocratic order and the way they ran things, and you had no exposure to anything else really for like in any memory of their mindset. And then here comes along this movement, wanting, more equality, bread for everyone, land, peace, and all these other things that they would present as what they were for. I imagine, well, yeah, who doesn't want those things, right? Sure. But he went to the Soviet Union to observe, I guess, what communism was accomplishing. Did he go there expecting to see something great or just to check on it? What was he searching for at that time?
Yeah, I think so. The official reason for his visit, he was invited for the 10-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So this is late 1927, so 1917 to 1927. He's invited as one of the official foreign guests to see the festivities, the celebrations associated with that. Mm-hmm. And he's excited at the beginning. And there's no question. The first portion of the book, he is optimistic of what he's going to see. There's a perception. The Soviet Union was quite closed at that time. People didn't really know what was going on inside, but there was a perception, sort of an optimistic perspective, that they were in the process of witnessing this new socialist utopia being built, that Russia was on its way towards this new society. And I think he was very excited to see whether that was going to be the case. I think he hoped it was going to be the case for sure, but yeah, but it didn't. I think over the course as the book went on, he sees more and more that doesn't quite relate to that.
Was 1920? Well, in your studies, your research, was 1927 the first year they let anybody from the outside come to the Soviet Union? No, or had there been other guests prior to that?
Yeah, I think people had been in before. I don't know any off the top of my head, but this was a sort of a special thing that he was invited to come see.
Well, I'm curious, just because of, I'm probably not on the same level as you, but on my research of the whole 20th century, and especially the conflicts and the political activities and all, when the Soviet Union would invite somebody over that was prominent or special, they intended to get propaganda value out of it. Okay. And they wanted them to see certain things of their society. When I read your article, I'm under the assumption that Wegner got to see other things that maybe others would not have seen or paid attention to. Maybe, I don't know if that's the case.
No, I think that's very true. And you see at the first part of his stay is in Moscow, and that's for the festivities. And I think he gets a lot of exposure to the propaganda there. A lot of the putting the best face forward. Look at the bountiful meals we can put together, look at the power of our military, look at the power of these parades. So he sees that's all put forward for the festivities. As his travels progress, I wouldn't say he's travels freely, because he has a lot of difficulty with, police stopping him, searching him. Yeah, but he is at least able to travel to other parts of the Soviet Union and see stuff with his own eyes and record it. That's not necessarily put forward by the communist government.
It's almost like he was acting on a hunch, sort of like he did back in Armenia. He's
Sure.
like something's not right here. I'm going to go check it out. It seems like almost he's in the Soviet Union. He has this official presentation, but it's like something's like, you need to check into this a little more. I mean, I can maybe see him doing that there. What are some of the things he found out though on his travels that kind of made him relook at things a little bit?
Yeah, I think the overarching theme is, by the end of the book, I think you don't get this so much at the beginning. By the end, I think he's accumulated so many observations about the repression. So if you come back to the perception that this was going to be this free utopia of workers, that the only reason Russia and any society by extension was not successful was, the capitalist class were keeping the workers down, and if we just lop off that class, we'll be able to work together and build this prosperous socialist society. And he did not see that. He noted the poverty everywhere he went, especially in the Caucasus, around the Black Sea, and in the mountains. He was very concerned with the repression, the state repression that he saw as just a continuation of what was the czars. The revolution had overthrown this autocratic empire of Russia, the czar, and all of the things he sees, he talks about the censorship of his mail, he talks about the secret police, he talks about the no free speech, if in fact sent you to Siberia if you spoke freely about anything that wasn't the official communist line. That's all stuff that's right out of the czar's playbook, and that's everything that the people who conducted the revolution were selling the revolution as getting rid of. And I think he sees that contradiction all through, and it's sad to read, because the people that pay the price for that are the people he's most sympathetic to, which are just the regular people of Russia.
Right. It's as if, and you wrote that in your article, it's the old czarist aristocratic system was simply just replaced with a new form of aristocrats. They were just now party members or something.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's the great irony of what he saw, and I think is just in communism in general, is that the ruling class doesn't go away. It just gets replaced by a new one. And in this case, it was he calls them the privileged workers, the ones that
right.
Were selected and placed above everybody else.
That's right. Yeah, because they said the exact correct things to say, and so they're more privileged, I guess, than the other. So I would find it interesting, though, that his observations, him being from Germany, was going through a very difficult time as well about that time, its own recessions and depressions and constant government conflict. And they were, of course, having issues with far left-wing groups fighting with other groups. The Weimar Republic just couldn't provide a very stable society as well. And it wasn't known for its prosperity either. But coming from that, he looks at the Soviet Union and says, man, you all are poor, by comparison. That's amazing, because one of the things promised by the Bolshevik Revolution is that there would be this prosperity for the workers, but he's not seeing it. Did he give any specific examples of why he thought this was the case? It's speculation, I guess, but he tends to focus on the conditions that he sees with the people. There's not a lot of, I guess, macroeconomic theory, if you will, but and it's interesting to point out when you talk about the context that this is all going on in. We're seeing this. The book is released in 1930, and he's talking about what he sees in 1927, 1928. Yes. And what he's observing is not even close to what, you talk 1930, the Soviet Union is about to go into 15 years of just catastrophe. And so he's just seeing the very tip of this and already deeply concerned about what he observes. Right. The timing is especially important, at least, and I think you saw it too, is it's right before Stalin seizes power, and like you said, takes him into that 15-year descent into hell. To be mild about it, really.
Yeah.
But it's at that time, but it's after Lenin and it's before Stalin. So it's at that time where maybe at least to the communists and maybe to other aspirants in the world, this is a magical time that this is actually going to work. Here's this golden experiment. Because I've heard apologists for communism, if you could say, would say, well, if they just followed Lenin's model, it would have worked better. If they didn't get rid of Trotsky, it would have came out right. If they'll admit that Stalin was wrong, because you can't always get that either, then they fall back on, well, yeah, he maybe took a wrong turn here, but the principles were sound. And if it was only stayed with the original mindset of the revolution, it would have came out well. But here we have an actual firsthand observation from someone there in that golden time frame, and I'm using that term to explain the hope of it, I suppose. And he's seeing something totally different. So this provides an insight that's different than, say, during the Cold War, right?
Sure. And one point I would say on that is there's no end to Monday morning quarterbacking this thing. I mean, you will go back and say you should have done this, that, or the other thing, but just look at who is writing this. If anybody who would question, this is someone who is admittedly sympathetic to what they're trying to accomplish, and also someone who throughout his life gave numerous examples that he was willing to tell the truth at risk to his own life. He has no incentive to present this in anything but authenticity. And it's to anybody who would say they should have done something differently, just I would say go back and look at what it was before it even got that bad.
But well, exactly. I mean, like you said, he had the integrity to call the Ottomans being within a nation that was allied with them and didn't want to hear about it. Right. And then he had the audacity after this, I'm assuming, to deal with the Nazis and how they were executing more and more of their program with the Jewish question, as they would call it. And even then, he calls out both, well, what we would say the right and the left. He didn't have any political allegiance that stopped him from looking for the facts. So he has a good ethos, I think, in which to consider what he has written here.
You talk about the right and the left. When the book was released, it was the Soviets banned it, and then the Nazis burned it, and it's
that's right,
because it didn't conform to either of their ideologies. It's one of those things. It's a good historical rule of thumb that if both the Nazis and the Soviets hate your work, you're probably doing good work.
Then you're somewhere on the right track. Yeah. Yes. I guess with that, then, looking at what he had written, comparing it through, the history of the communist movement, do you see like there being simple inherent dangers of communism that are universal, regardless of whose approach of communism you would use?
Sure. I mean, you look at this, if you contrast it with capitalism, which is what is always contrasted with, what capitalism harnesses the positives in human nature. It harnesses creativity, it harnesses ambition, it harnesses competence, and it hitches the economy of the country to those horses, which are positive human horses, if you will. Communism does the exact opposite. It relies on compulsion, it relies on force taking, it relies on collectivization to the detriment of the individual, and that's a flaw that's inherent to the system. You could never eliminate that because then it wouldn't be Marxism. And so, I'm sorry.
That's one of the things he mentioned about. I want to say it was the housing, especially in the Caucasus, was absolutely horrendous, and his conclusion was because no one owned them, no one took care of them.
Right.
So there was no investment into the system, and it was, if you force me to fix it, I will, but if not, I'm not going to, type of thing.
Right. I picked that example out because it's relevant to anybody today. It doesn't need to be a house. It's any property. It's self-evident that you'll take care of the property you own and are responsible for. But if the state is responsible for it or somebody else, you have no incentive to do that. And he saw that. And I think anybody who lives today can understand that.
I believe the best test that you can give most, let's say the average college student, is to have them do one of them. They infuriate me, the group projects where you have the same grade for the group effort and you have like no one do it but that one person. That right there to me demonstrates you all don't like socialism, because that's exactly what it is.
Well, that group mentality, Wegner talks about this. It's instilled from childhood. I mean, he visits kindergartens where the toys. You think of a kindergarten, like a 5-year-old. What toy would a kindergartner like to play with? Yeah. And he goes there, and the toys they're given are all these strange shapes, like cubes and beams, and they're only allowed to play with toys that they can play with at least one other child. So they have to play with it together.
Oh, wow!
No individual toys. Taught to teach them that they never, can do anything alone. And then when they go off to pick berries in the forest, he says they're never allowed to keep any for themselves. They have to all put it into a communal basket, and then the teacher distributes to whatever child they're entitled to. So it starts very young, and he's clearly disturbed by that in his writing.
So it's like the entire system is using behavioral conditioning from the crib to the rest of their life on just you can't be alone. I'm assuming you can't think for yourself. Everything is provided for you, and you just kind of exist to go along with it. Is that sort of what they had going?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summation. I mean, he compares them to compares the whole society to like an ant colony more than once. It's just how it's been. They just exist as part of this society that he recognizes. They're all trying to work towards something greater, but he's skeptical that I think by the end he's skeptical that they're ever going to get there. And it does start very young, and it's continued throughout their lives.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you really like Rage of the Age, we will encourage you to leave a review on the platform that you're listening to, but especially if you would like a copy of my book, Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire, which is a first-hand account of my second deployment to Iraq, and it's filled with many spiritual insights. I'm going to give away 10 copies for free, and every week I will give out a copy for someone who leaves a review of this podcast. You can do that by going to Twitter, write your review, and then hashtag it Rage of the Age Now, or you can go to Facebook, find our page, Rage of the Age, click the reviews, recommend us, and then write in your review. Today's winner for the review goes out to Scott Miller, who wrote this review on Twitter. I really love this podcast. I love the guest on the show. I haven't been able to find another podcast that offers such unique perspectives for the current political climate. Scott Miller, thank you for your kind review. You can look forward to receiving your signed copy of Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire soon.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
This thing they're working for, I guess, is it's going to seem to be ever elusive. He mentioned how the powers that be there in the Soviet Union at the time looked at the people actually as sheep, right? That they were just to be corralled around to do whatever you tell them to do, and that was basically the purpose of their existence or something, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what he does. He compares it to sheep, and he says the bureaucratic officials he sees it's just total disregard for the needs of the people they're supposed to serve. I remember one passage in the book. I think he's in Georgia. He's certainly in that part of the Soviet Union, where he talks about how hard it is just to find somebody, one of the officials that's supposed to do their job, I think it's a travel related job. And he says they show up for work like 2 hours a day. And while they're there, they don't really, they won't acknowledge you when you walk in. There's just a total indifference to the needs of the people. It's very cynical. And that's some of the strongest language he uses in the entire book has to do with the officials he meets.
I have to ask this: is this comparable to the DMV, or is it worse?
No, I think maybe that's the best comparison we have. No, it's far worse. I mean, there was another example where he talks to a friend who had one of those kind of jobs, and he was asked by his superior to put out this official statement that he disagreed with in a newspaper on some policy. And then a few weeks later, that policy changed, and he was fired because he had done what he was told and put out the statement. So it's the most corrupt system you can think of.
Well, a dangerous system, well, from what I understand in my study of it, is you could be right with the party and the movement, and then next week somebody's interpretation of something could change, and the next thing you know, you're an enemy of the state. But you were following exactly what you're supposed to the whole time, right? I mean,
yeah, that's my understanding too, and I think that reaches its terrible zenith just within a decade of when he does this trip. Towards the end of the 30s, the Great Terror under Stalin was just it was that to a mechanized just execution level.
Yeah, because I've read other accounts like from Tortured for Christ and other accounts of being in the Soviet Union, and just the way that system was very cutthroat. I mean, you had to know it's not what you believed or did for the communist cause. It was really who you were aligned with and whether they were going to be the one who wins or not. If you were on the losing side, like with Trotsky or anybody else, you were done. You were enemy of the state instantly. Very cutthroat. He also mentioned something about having a conversation with a writer for, I'm assuming, Pravda, who would get paid a ruble per line, making more than another writer who's not as known or successful in that system. And that writer basically justified it using a capitalistic expression, if you will, but still writing the truth, because that's what Pravda means about the communist movement. I found that very ironic, and that was probably meant to be that way, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of my favorite examples from the book. I don't know if it was Pravda. It was certainly a Soviet newspaper, and he was paid double what a lesser writer was, and he justified it. He says, "I'm a bigger writer. I'm a better writer. I should get paid more." And Wegner writes that he doesn't respond to this because he questioned whether it was communistic to the guy's face. And my thought was, well, if you're a better writer, you get paid more because you deliver a better product to the market. Who's the market? It's the readership of that newspaper. It's capitalism. It's just contained within a self-described Soviet system.
Right. It's like there's always this tension within communism it has to stay tied to some capitalism to survive, but it refuses to acknowledge its existence. It's just, I don't know how they get through their cognitive dissonance the way they do with trying to make that work in harmony,
Capitalism is the natural state of people. It's just how people interact with each other. And any attempt to modify that is just going to be unsuccessful. And you'll have to give more and more until it either collapses or it stops becoming socialist.
Right. And like you said, to make that adaptable, it's an unnatural thing. To make it work, they have to almost resort to force every time eventually.
Yeah, right? I think it's a necessary, because you're asking people to work against their own interests and the interest of their families or the interest of their community, whoever they want to help. That's all secondary to the state. It's all secondary to the community, or I should say the broader community of the entire nation.
Right.
And it's not a natural thing for people to do, so it must be compelled by force, and that's what you see.
Yeah, and I don't think those who were wanting the communism to come in their day realized that's what was coming with it, right?
No, I think it's, you can't really put what we know today, of course, on people back then. If
Sure.
I were to go back in time and say and make all these arguments to somebody in 1927, or maybe even to Wegner himself, you could plausibly come back to that and say, well, it's never been tried. You don't know that. We've just had your system the entire time. Let's try something different. But today, that's not the case. We have the whole 20th century to look back on, and that
right. And having said that you posted something to open your article with, which is an eye opener to me. You wrote that when this is based from, or this comes from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, a poll that they did, and that's only been a few months ago that they took this. It said that more than 1/3 of the American millennials viewed communism favorably. 15% believed the world would be better if the Soviet Union still existed. And 22% believed that society would be better off if private property were abolished. Like you said, we have the hindsight visibility to see through history that communism has this abysmal human rights record, has this abysmal economic performance. Why do you think communism is becoming appealing again? Is it just trendy, or is there like a real movement here?
So I think both of those are correct. It's probably a little bit of both. There is an organized communist movement in the United States that's gaining, I should say, left socialist / communist movement that's gaining more traction.
Yeah.
As for why that is, I think the same sales pitch, if you will, that motivated people in the 1890s, in the 1930s, in the 1960s, and today is the same one. It's that society will be better off if we lop off the capitalist class and redistribute the wealth of the nation to the workers, to the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think that pitch is the same. As to why it's taking root now, I think a lot of the people could just not know the past. I think that, it's not necessarily taught terribly well in schools. Pretty ignorance. It could be and then it could range all the way from willful blindness to outright, intentional deception. But, it's interesting, to buy that product, the communism product, like it's almost like, it's like going onto Amazon and buying this spectacular, product that's being sold to you without reading any of the reviews at the bottom. And we have those reviews available to us in the form of all sorts of historical accounts.
That's a very good illustration, because I've got burnt that way. I see the picture, I see the claims, I'm like, whoa, I need that. And I just buy it. And I didn't bother to look at it. It had like, half a star rating or something. And then I get very, frustrated after the fact. But hey, good luck getting your money back, that sort of thing. Sure. This is on a grander scale. I mean, this ain't a bad purchase. This is a bad mode of life that you're not going to get rid of anytime soon. It's just it's intense. It will invade your life. It will invade your space and invade your society. And it seems that only force is the only thing that seems to be available to make it let go, really.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's and he talks about that throughout the book, that the repression, the censorship, the crackdown on any kind of speech is a feature that disturbs him the most. And for people today, think about if you knew your grandparents and what age. My grandparents were born between late 1920s, early 1930s, so right about the time this is taking place.
Yeah.
So think about their childhood. Think about how they grew up in the United States, and times were tougher back then, but certainly, after reading his account and thinking about how my grandparents grew up, you'd never want to trade places. It's not even close. And that's, you almost have to make it personal like that to fully appreciate kind of what you're reading.
I think that's very true. Because I remember my grandparents telling me how they lived through the Great Depression and everything they had to go through to get through that, and then the Second World War and just a bunch of stuff they've been through. And I was like, I thought, man, they had it so bad.
Right.
But in comparison, like you said, in the Soviet Union, far worse. Sure. Way worse. And it was planned that way and executed that way. That's what's the crazy thing, Yeah.
And, this book published in 1930, we're talking only 2 or 3 years until we hit the what's called either the Great Famine or a couple other names, but millions and millions of people starved to death in the early 1930s as a direct result of these policies, especially in the Ukraine. And you compare that to the Great Depression was horrible here. It impacted the national psyche forever, but it's nothing remotely close.
If I'm not mistaken, part of that famine was caused by a desire to try this experiment that wheat could grow in the winter, because they could somehow evolve it to work that way or something. I don't know. It was official at the time. The powers that be loved it, thought it was great, but the next thing you know, you got a famine. And it's just stuff like that. It's like, in my mind, in the United States, we can go, that's dumb, don't do that. But in that system, even though people probably knew that's dumb, don't do that, they weren't going to dare say anything.
No.
They would rather let the nation starve. That's the difference in the mindsets. Is there any other examples that come to your mind that we're talking about this from his book that just kind of stick out to you right now?
Yeah. Interestingly, what you just said about the people that understood that it was bad, but would never say anything. There's a passage in the book where he meets somebody. I believe it is in Ukraine, but it's certainly near there. And he's an Austrian, this person, and he talks openly to Wegner, and he says, "Look, if you can get anybody to speak honestly about this, and that's a big if. He says that in a sense that you're not going to get somebody to speak honestly, but if you could, he says that 95% of the people are going to be unhappy. They think it's terrible. But they could never say that. If they said that, it was, off to Siberia. And he records those rumors too. He's heard about that as well.
Right, which is ironically something they borrowed from the Tsarist to send people off to Siberia.
Lenin and Trotsky, they were both sent there too. That was right out of the Tsarist playbook, and they just gets continued. And all this stuff it's all the same. It's just the same abuses and a different master is really what you find.
Wow. So, looking at communism in the past, and this is me just brainstorming here. I mean, thinking out loud, but I'm tending to think there's like a mutant form of communism from the century prior, and I think maybe that's what's emboldening some to say this one's more, perfect version or something. Because I've seen that argument that all those attempts, the very ones who preached the communism didn't know how to do it right or something, but you figured it out. Good for you. But there's like this remorphed version, which at least my perception is they target people groups. It's not just haves or have-nots anymore. Because you have once the have-nots had something, they lost the revolutionary flair, which they could not. The revolutionaries could not stand. They wanted that constant tension, but now it's just people groups, identity politics sort of thing is how I see this. That's how I see the communist agenda being pushed, is through identity politics, because of the egalitarian Marxist social conflict theory concepts are kind of just morphed into that. I mean, have you looked into that at all, if there's any comparison?
I'd agree that the whole essence of Marxism, communism, it pits groups of people against each other. You have to have the enemy, you have to have the opponent, and if you can't make those divisions in society, then you can't set a good guy versus bad guy. And this was part of Marxist theory, even my understanding, all the way back through the 19th century, that you can't have the revolution. And so it's always about how to frame the good guy versus bad guy in their mind, and how to divide society along those lines. And I'm sure it's just, today we're seeing different manifestations of that, and different, like you said, not necessarily in the traditional Marxist proletariat, bourgeoisie lines, but in other ways.
Right. So when you were studying that book, Five Fingers Over You, did it go over, I assume it went over maybe in the forward or something, the history of the book, did it get a big readership in its day, or is that why it didn't make it into English? It just kind of like, that's nice and thrown aside, or was it just suppressed? What was the deal?
Yeah, I mean, it did. I think it got a not an overwhelming reception, but it was well received, and I think it got a pretty good readership at the time of its publication. I think 12 languages is my memory and what it was.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Not English. But in the timing, in some respects, was poor, because it was published in 1930, and what do you have by 1933? You have Nazis in power in Germany, and they're never going to allow this to be read. So it never. I wouldn't be surprised if that suppression in the country in which it was published was a reason it kind of got pushed aside historically, compared to what it might have been had it been published in Britain or the United States or somewhere like that.
Yeah. So I got to say, when I saw the cover of the book, the picture cover of the book, and then I hear the title "Five Fingers Over You," in my imagery, I'm picturing like this puppet master with his fingers holding these strings, like animating your every move. You're nothing but a puppet to the state. And if they want you to move, they'll move. If they don't want you to move, then, and if you exercise any bit of life of your own, well, they just cut the life strings from you and reattach a different puppet. I mean,
that's a good comparison.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was the intention of the art, but I agree with you that the cover of the book definitely gives that. The title is interesting, and it comes from according to Wegner, it comes from a greeting that the communists used to give one another, where they would raise their 5 fingers and make them into a fist over their head, and these represent the 5 continents that must hold together for the future of the socialist revolution, kind of thing. So it was almost a greeting that he observed.
Oh, so it's like a symbol of their international presence, sort of thing, and solidarity of the proletariat and all that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. I didn't know. I'm just saying that was the first, I was like, that was the imagery in my head, like this, this evil puppet master, keeping control over everything. You said there was a concerted effort in the United States for the communist movement. Where do you see that taking place at?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I see a concerted effort for communism, but there's certainly a sympathy for an acceptance of socialism that is not only manifested in those polls, but also stuff that you see just in mainstream policy proposals that are starting to get put out. And I guess you could put those on, so you could put those on the same spectrum. Is Venezuela a communist country? Well, I'm not sure it's officially classified as one, but there's certainly a lot of the same economic and human rights disasters you would see in a communist society are present there. So it's a spectrum, and I'm concerned that, and the term I used in the article is one I borrowed from that poll is historical amnesia, and I think that's what we've got, because we're just moving farther and farther away from when we had concrete examples of what this was like, and now it's starting to creep back in different ways, like
right.
But,
well, it reminds me of the Babylon Bee article I saw once, where I think the title was something to the effect of, "If only we had document evidence to disprove socialism, then we could know for sure. If only,
Yeah. Where will we find that?
I mean, if only we had the data to look at. I mean, but it's like we don't. I don't know.
Where can we find that in history?
The amnesia is real, I suppose. But all right, is there anything else you want to add about this article or the book before we close out, Robert?
I recommend anybody who's interested in history to read the book. It's if you're interested in, how the book is laid out, and people may not realize this, is it's not a narrative that he wrote. He came back and thought about what he saw and put it all together into this thesis that he's going to prove. He just it's just his diary entries. It's his letters that he's put chronologically together to show you what he sees at the time he sees it. I thought it was a tremendously honest and authentic way to view that part of the world at that time. And
so these are notes that he basically smuggled out, that he kept in real time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I don't know if he had to smuggle them out, but he sent letters and in real time, and his diary, and he put those all together as the book. And so you're reading his thoughts, you're reading his thoughts at the time, not necessarily his thoughts in the retroactive.
Robert, it's been a real pleasure having you speak with us today about Five Fingers Over You, the book by Armin Wegner. I appreciate the work that you do with the Capital Research Center. I think it's a very honorable profession you all are doing, is holding people to task. I like the statement of the Central Research Center as far as like what they're about, is that they believe in the Constitution, the free market, but they also believe in holding our officials accountable regardless of party. So you don't get a pass for your shenanigans, no matter who you are. You do important work there. It's been real great having you on the show with us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
And now it's time for the question of the week. Last week, the question of the week was, which political party is going to accomplish their goals? I want to highlight a response by John McCoy, who wrote, "Neither one. Dems won't destroy America, and Republicans won't make a smaller government or get people to use their God-given brains. I'm sure many feel that way. I've seen a few other answers as well. It seems as if no one's going to do what they promised or can't do what they promised. And I hope that the Americans do use their God-given brains to figure out exactly what they do need for their country. The question of the week for this week is in line with the interview that we're having today. And I want to ask it like this. What makes socialism so appealing? I'm going to post this on Twitter, Rage of the Age Now, and I'm going to post this on Facebook page, Rage of the Age. Find that question, answer it, respond it, and we will look at it again next week. Again, the question, what makes socialism so appealing?
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Now it's time for our essay segment. Talking with Robert Stilson today about the book Five Fingers Over You by Armin Wegner reminds me of many hours I've put in over the years studying the history, especially of the 20th century, looking at all the political activity. Ironically, I would study the military history, but in military history, which I think are more honest historians, in military history, you oftentimes look at the political aspects behind the forces because you want to see, okay, did the political situation change the military situation? Or, did these policies prevent the military from being effective? Did this one work better? What made the military operate the way it did because of the political setups? So it would draw me into studying the political natures behind a lot of these armies. And in the 20th century, communism and socialism were growing in popularity, but they were heavily tied to the nation's politics and the militaries and how they function. When you study things like the Russian Civil War, you have to look at how communism played a part in organizing their armies. When you look at the Spanish Civil War, you look at the part that the socialists and the anarchists and the communists had in affecting the army of Republican Spain. When you look at World War II, you're going to look at how the communist regime under Stalin affected his military. When you look at the Korean War, it was the communists who invaded North Korea. When you look at the Vietnam War, both with the French with Indochina and the Americans in South Vietnam, you have to look at the politics, which are, especially in communist armies, absolutely interwoven into their military. They're not inseparable, as in the Western mind we try to make it. In the leftist mindset, the military and politics are merged as one entity. There's no separation in them. And so when I look over the years, especially at what's known as the February Revolution, and then you had the Red Revolution or Red October that took place in October of 1917, where the Bolsheviks eventually seized power, at least in part of the old Russian Empire, trying to form a new communist government. Once they seized power, they still had to fight a lengthy civil war with other forces that were against them. And the Bolsheviks by that time had made plenty of enemies, and it was only their absolute brutality which helped them kind of hold out in the end, despite some inefficiencies from their enemies just the same. But I bring this up to you because I want to try to bridge the gap between the past and now from things that I see that are going on. In the original February uprising, I'll call it that. I'm not necessarily going to call it a revolution. In the February uprising in 1917, the Russian Empire had been tired from the First World War. People were starving, absolute abuse and inefficiency of the government. People were just fed up with the war. They were fed up with living conditions, and there was no food to eat. I mean, people were starving in these massive cities. And in particular, this one it was called Petrograd at the time. Used to be called St. Petersburg before that. Not long after would be named Leningrad. And then it's now called St. Petersburg again. But in this city, especially, this is where it took place, you have people coming into the streets to protest the war and the lack of food. But what happened was activists began to coordinate these activities. They began to mobilize these people to accomplish their political goals. And it was the Bolsheviks doing it, but there were also other groups trying to mobilize these people into their cause and mobilize that for political capital. Among the things attacked were police stations. And any signs of authority was basically either intimidated or attacked or destroyed or whatnot. Eventually, a provisional government was formed. All right, and I'm going to cover a few of these things because I want to kind of show you how there are some on the left, they operate this way since the inception of these ideas, and they're still doing it, and I want to point it out to you. Once this provisional government was formed, it was basically a conglomeration of different peoples who were just against the old regime. But they didn't necessarily get along very well and had very varying ideas on what the new nation should look like. So it was like a confederation, if you will, of different people at odds with each other whose only unifying goal was get rid of the old power. The Bolsheviks taking advantage of these divisions, and the Bolsheviks were the ones who would eventually seize power. They're the powerhouse communism that would take hold in the Soviet Union. And they were called Bolsheviks because the name implies they were in the majority. And maybe at one point during a vote they were like that, but they kept that name for propaganda reasons. But the truth was they weren't the overwhelming majority politically, but they sure acted like it. And they flexed their muscle as if they were. But they would constantly hamstring the government to interfere with any governance whatsoever. And they were trying to purposely create instability in society and the government. Reason being, by October 1917, the phrase being armed uprising is inevitable, but actually it was premeditated. They make it sound like it's just bound to happen, but they had been instigating it and preparing it the whole time. They have made the executive authority of the state absolutely minimally effective. They began to replace these structures, if you will, with committees of armed workers, sailors and soldiers, and basically they would form these little, can I say it, militias. They would form these militias ruled by these committees, which the Bolsheviks, they were very concerted in keeping a heavy-handed control over these forces. And that basically became the new replacement powerhouse, if you will, in place of the government. See, the government can make decrees and issue out executive orders and things to be carried out, but they inhibit it in every way to where now the only real authority that could do anything was, well, their committees who had their own personal armies. In October 1917, also known as Red October, and this is supposed to be their glorious revolution, there's a fight that breaks out for bridges because the government got hint. Wow, you finally figured out what they were doing, right? But, a Bolshevik is always a Bolshevik. That was actually in a Russian election one time. It was not long after the Soviet Union fell, and the Communist Party was still trying to get elected again in the more democratic nature of the Russian Federation. And those who are for more democracy were very clever in basically playing newsreels and bringing up events of everything the Bolsheviks had done while in power. And their statement was, once a Bolshevik, always a Bolshevik. And you know what? That to me rings true even today. Once a Bolshevik, always a Bolshevik. Once a communist, once a socialist, that's what you are. You're not going to change your colors. You're going to always be what you've always been. We'll bring that forward here in a moment. But The government finally finds out. They should have realized it sooner. And they try to prevent the use of bridges in the city. So there was this fight for these bridges. The Bolsheviks were very keen to take over the telegraph station because they wanted to control the propaganda. They wanted to issue contrary orders, sow disinformation, and to push for the revolution, to command people to get into the street, to create mobs. That's their source of power. Mobilizing people's hatred, putting them in streets, creating chaos, causing indecision in government, preventing proper authorities from exercising their authority. And once you've created enough disorder, then you come in with what you have already planned to replace that disorder, and the next thing you know, you have a new regime. They make it look like it's a popular uprising, but the whole thing was staged from the very beginning. They move in, they seize power. And if you look at the history, it's not like it was an instant thing. They had to fight for years in what became known as the Russian Civil War to assert their authority, but they weren't averse to using worse repressions than the czarist regime they replaced in order to achieve this power. But I want you to know that this movement in Russia wasn't just a localized thing. There was an international effort at propagating this socialism. So it wasn't like each country did their own thing. This was an international goal. I mean, the song still of many a socialist is called The International. There's this idea that if workers around the world united, they could fight against all the oppression. And that's sort of their mindset. This is an international cause, not just a Russian one, even though they would still have issues with their own views of, Russians over others that they would contend with. But nonetheless, philosophically, officially, this is an international movement, and it still is. But I fast forward to events now, and I'm looking at Seattle as an example, but there's examples all over the place. In fact, there's protests in Europe about what happened in Michigan. Do you mean to tell me that people in Europe are mad because of what one officer did in our Michigan? They are there because it was organized. It was premeditated. And they make these protests. Notice how they happen at the same time in various cities in different countries. Do you think these people just decided, I'm mad about what happened in this other country I've never seen or been to, I'm just going to go into the streets and protest? No. The whole thing was orchestrated. But the impression they want to give is the whole world's mad. Of course, when the whole world's mad, you have to do something about it, right? Well, the thing that needs to be done, of course, they kind of slide it in there. These are things we want to do. When I look at the war in Vietnam, for example, when the Americans were involved, one of the recruiting approaches of the Viet Cong was turn your grief into action. So they would find people and villagers and city dwellers, whatever, that they had been wronged in some fashion. Something wrong happened to them. And usually it's tied to the government or to the Americans or whatever, and they come in and they say, turn your grief into action. We're angry too, but together we're going to work together and do something. And that was a huge recruiting tool. That approach did not die after that war. It's still being used today. Oh, you're mad. Well, we're mad too. Turn your grief into action. Join us, and we'll make something better. But I want to point out, and most of our history books won't show this because I believe there are leftist-minded people who control what's in our textbooks and circulate it on a national level to all the schools who are now beholden to a federal authority and shouldn't be. But nonetheless, they still had trouble recruiting and keeping people in the Viet Cong. Despite the grief, despite their appeal to that emotion, they still couldn't keep their ranks filled, to where the North Vietnamese had to continuously send cadres south to keep filling the ranks of that organization. Why? Because there were other groups that were not communists, that were also against the abuses of government. They tended to fare better in their recruitment drives. Why? Because they weren't communist. The Viet Cong were just as brutal, more brutal than the government they were fighting against. And it turned a lot of people off. Even still, that's the approach. The left always uses that approach. They try to get you angry over something, angry enough to where they can put you in a street somewhere, and then they can begin to send out their agents and work with you and try to coerce you, corral you, any means to pull you into their movement. And many are doing that not even knowing they're supporting things that in the end they wouldn't even support. But by your mere presence, they're taking credit for it. I look at Seattle again and I see that rocks, cement, feces has been thrown at officers, fireworks have been thrown. That look, if it was you, you would have opened fire by now. Yet we expect our police officers to stand there, take this abuse, and in the off chance they use tear gas, act like that's a crime against humanity. Seriously. Now maybe you're wondering why we've gotten to that point. Well, I'll tell you, it's all part of the bigger plan. This is what the left does. Intimidate and hamstring what the authorities can actually do. Then go out and actively challenge them and make them look impotent and get people to show up for it. And when they're there and you've mobilized them, that's what you do. And then it makes it look like your movement is bigger than it really is. We see numerous reports and videos where people are saying, we just had this gathering, this peaceful protest, and then these people show up, and the next thing you know, there's busted windows and fire going. Because what they're trying to do is cause a violent scene, and they're going to turn and use big media who they know they can count on, because their editors are usually leftists in nature, are going to say, well, the police must have provoked them, or the police are out of control. But none of them are saying the rioters are out of control. None of them are going, hey, they're purposely destroying property. Instead, they defend it and they say it's okay, even in treating them like heroes, that they've torched their neighbor's business, that they've set their neighborhood on fire, that they have shut down sanitation and prevented food supplies. And it's almost comical because now, even those on that side who are fighting those things are upset because you have all of these people coming as tourists just to view and take selfies. Hey, I'm in the land of Chaz, ha ha. And they're even mad at them for doing that. But you know what? That's part of the show. It's all a show. But the goal of the left is to use these things to seize power by inhibiting the true authority. When they say defund the police, do you really believe they don't intend to replace it with something else? You bet they will. And it's not going to be pretty. I encourage you, look at the history of the left and how it has operated. Look what you see going on in your country now. And I'm saying this in all earnesty. Be careful where you put your presence. Be careful where you stand, because they will use you standing there to support something that maybe you didn't support. We need to be smarter about what we're doing, and we need to call out the shenanigans when we see it. Read the history. See for yourself.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.